Alrighty, Senator Michael Brooks Jimenez, thank you very much for joining me, sir.
Well, thank you for having me, man. I appreciate it.
Of course, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And if you wouldn't mind by beginning by introducing yourself and the work you've been up to in recent years.
Sure. So my name is Michael Brooks Jimenez, and so I've been an immigration attorney for 26 years, I think. And I've also served in the state senate representing District 44, Southside of Oklahoma City, probably for the past 7 years.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And this past congressional session in particular has been one of lots of hot button issues that have been statewide attention, but it's also national-wide attention. And
Sure.
in some ways, the immigration topic in particular has been
Right.
sort of at the state level, it's been a
Right.
battleground in similar ways to how it's been on the federal level. So perhaps the most famous piece of legislation in this respect would be House Bill 4156. So if you wouldn't mind
Sure.
introducing what that is and what your work with respect
Right.
to it has been.
Well, and so yes, after serving probably for 7 years in the legislature, this last year has definitely been the toughest. And it's basically with the ascendancy of that issue as far as illegal immigration and the crisis at the border, that it's been one of those things that we've been playing defense this session and this past session. And so as a result, I want to say that there were probably 5 or 6 kind of just blatantly anti-immigrant bills that were proposed, including one that would have made just someone's unlawful presence a felony. As far as there were other bills to try and limit people's ability to own property in the state of Oklahoma, a variety of different things. And so mostly playing defense, trying to be able to kill those bills. And then late into session, probably within the last 3 or 4 weeks, the Supreme Court came up with a decision having to do with SB 4 out of Texas, which was an anti-immigrant bill that was passed there. And so within less than 24 hours after the Supreme Court issued their decision, basically allowing that case to be able to go forward, the Attorney General for the state of Oklahoma, as well as the Speaker of the House, asked or released press releases saying that they wanted a law similar for the state of Oklahoma. And so what happened is it probably took, I think, about 2 weeks to draft. They had to suspend all the rules as far as the normal committee process, the normal vetting process that all legislation goes through. They had to suspend all of those rules to be able to slam House Bill 4156 through.
Mm-hmm. And what specifically would be the consequence of this bill?
Well, and so what it does is it criminalizes something, a term that I think the state of Oklahoma made up, which is unlawful occupation. And so as far as the definition of unlawful occupation, I guess it's people who've unlawfully entered the United States. And so it would not include people who've overstayed their visa based on the way that it's written. But really, to me, just kind of following these things, and especially in an election year, that this seems like it's much more of a political bill than a policy bill. And so something maybe to make headlines, maybe to increase certain people's profiles, especially people that are interested in running for governor, not me, other people. But to be able to do those things as opposed to being able to make a working piece of legislation that actually is implementable and enforceable.
Right. And so it's worth detailing why that is the case, because in addition to the rather draconian bill as it was presented,
Right.
there's also like a staunch effort not to take up any amendments, which you and other members of the Latino caucus fought for.
Yes.
But were just basically not heard at all in that case. So can you detail what some of the
No,
amendments?
absolutely. And so no, we offered some, because I mean at this point if the Supreme Court is making kind of signals that perhaps they might be amenable to allowing the states to be able to be involved in immigration policy, rather than to come up with an enforcement only bill like House Bill 4156, we proposed a couple of amendments that would have made it more comprehensive, that really would have allowed the state of Oklahoma to be able to do something more holistically to be able to address the problem of illegal immigration. And so one of those amendments basically would have created a cause of action for any American citizen or legal permanent resident that was wrongly identified or wrongly arrested for unlawful occupation. Because that was one of the true concerns from a lot of people, is that they might be profiled. And if an American citizen or legal permanent resident was profiled for this, that this would create a cause of action with liquidated damages of $10,000 per occurrence against that law enforcement agency that made that wrongful arrest. Mm-hmm. And then the other amendment basically was to allow those people who are long-term residents in the state of Oklahoma, those people who've been here long enough that they've been able to file tax returns, that they would be able to qualify either for a state ID or for a driver's license. And if someone were here and undocumented, but actually had gone through the process to be able to get a state ID or a driver's license based on the amendment, then there would be an exception for them that they could not be arrested for unlawful occupation either.
Mm-hmm. And I do want to go into some detail, particularly on the first one you mentioned. Sure. And in plain terms, it'd be so that somebody who's wrongfully racially profiled in the auspices of this bill would be able to sue the state for $10,000. Now, this was rejected basically with that argumentation. But one of the problems with this is that in the case of racial profiling under this bill, right, you can imagine that somebody who's sued for racial profiling would sue for much more, in fact. And so you could have more of these cases.
Well, I mean, the thing is that there was no money allocated for training for law enforcement. Sure. And since then, Tulsa County Sheriff's Office, the Oklahoma City Police Department, Tulsa Police Department, and the Association of Police Chiefs have all said that this bill is basically unimplementable, that they can't implement this law just because it's so vague, and they would be violating their own policies when it comes to racial prohibiting racial profiling.
Mm-hmm. And so that gets to the more expanded problem with this, is that although it almost certainly will have fiscal implications, none of that was considered by the authors of the bill. Right. It was mentioned by the Latino caucus, by other members that oppose this bill. And so, I mean, even to this day, Kevin Stitt still takes that position that he doesn't expect it will have a fiscal impact. It wasn't accounted for in the budget processes, but pretty obviously it will if it were to be put in place.
Well, right, and if it were actually implemented and people were arrested for this, in addition to those people who are arrested and required to leave the state, you have to consider their families, and you have to consider the chilling effect for the entire immigrant population. Mm-hmm. And so currently immigrants make up 11% of the workforce in the state of Oklahoma. And it's mostly in hard to fill positions, whether it be hospitality, including hotel maids and people who work in restaurants, whether it has to do with agriculture, or whether it has to do with construction. I mean, anybody who's living in reality is willing to acknowledge that those jobs are mostly filled by immigrants. And so if we were to fully implement this law, there's a chance that those sectors would definitely suffer as a result.
Sure. That, and more broadly, I mean, in terms of what Oklahoma's image kind of at the national level, at a broader level too, I mean, this is certainly one thing that's also not being considered by the authors of the bill, that if you make the state, as the authors intended, quote, the most unappealing state in the country for immigrants, right? This is also bad for business as well. In addition to being like bad morally, I mean, there's also economic implications that almost certainly would be experienced if the bill were to be enforced.
Right, no, without a doubt. And so whether or not new businesses that the state of Oklahoma is trying to invite or trying to convince to locate in the state of Oklahoma, if we lose 11% of our workforce, not only does it impact those companies directly, but it also impacts quality of life, right? And right now, Oklahoma is enjoying a boom to some degree when it comes to the restaurant scene, when it comes to construction. You know, that Oklahoma City right now is one of the best places to be able to go and work, you know, based on several different rankings. And so if we were to do something that was basically a means to be able to gut the workforce, then I think that the overall economic impact would be hard to calculate just because of that. And again, with the amendment that we proposed, the only way that people would be able to get a driver's license or a state ID is if they actually filed their state and federal tax returns. And so the projected overall fiscal impact of that could be upwards of close to $50 million in additional revenue to the state of Oklahoma if we could ever do something expanding driver's license eligibility.
Right, yeah, and so those are all things that obviously would be catastrophic to the state's economy, in particular with, I mean, as you mentioned, there's some momentum brewing that Oklahoma could really prosper in the near future, but unfortunately this puts it into jeopardy. But fortunately there have been efforts, currently there are efforts in the courts, but before we get to those, I'd like to mention some other efforts that have been done for the demonstrations that you were the key organizer of as well. So Could you say a little bit about those?
Right. Well, and so one of the things that Representative Annie Mentz did actually before I ever arrived at the Capitol is she was able to start Hispanic Heritage Day. And so that started, I think, about 8 years ago. And so really it was an opportunity for Latinos to come to the Capitol and to have an opportunity to meet their representatives and senators, and then at the same time to be able to share our culture with people at the Capitol so that they could learn more about us. And so over those 8 years, it's been very successful. And so we had already identified May 15th as the date that we're going to have Hispanic Heritage Day. But like I said, toward the end of session, this bill came, House Bill 4156 came out of nowhere. And the Hispanic community, as well as the Hispanic caucus, came out hard against this proposed piece of legislation. And so as a result, whenever it passed, along straight party lines, and the governor made the decision to be able to sign the bill and make it law, there really wasn't an appetite in our community to come and share our culture, because we've tried it for 7 years. And apparently the only result was that when politics went ahead of policy, that we were the scapegoat. And so as a result, and then after working as hard as we possibly could behind the scenes to either divert the bill or to be able to amend it in some way that it would make it workable, when those requests were denied, then we went from working behind the scenes to being able to allow our community to come and to be able to use their voice. And so as a result, it was on a weekday, which there are lots of people who are working, but we had anywhere, I would say, between 4,000 and 5,000 people in the plaza in front of the Capitol, which was amazing. We had upwards of probably 3,000 of those people who decided to come inside the building. And so whenever they were able to come inside the building, they were able to get something to eat, something to drink. And then they were also able to get cards that would allow them to be able to write notes to their senator, their representative, and also to the governor.
Yep. And so that was the bigger of the two demonstrations, but there had been one actually prior to that one. So that, as you mentioned, that was after the passage and everything.
Sure.
But during the process, which was very sped up, rushed
Sure.
process, fortunately, some other groups, particularly LULAC, which I happen to be a board member of,
Sure.
we organized a demonstration the day it was being heard on the Senate, and unfortunately passed
Right.
in the Senate. And that was also middle of the day, weekday, something like
Sure.
4 or 5 days notice, and hundreds of people turned out. So
Sure.
there certainly is an appetite, certainly at the level of the population. But beyond these demonstrations at the popular level, there are there's litigation going on in the courts. So could you give us an update on what the status of that is?
Sure. And so, yes. And so what happened is that after the governor signed the bill, the U.S. Attorney General's office, Department of Justice, sent a letter to, I believe, to the governor and then also to the Attorney General, explaining that there's currently case law that says immigration is within the exclusive province of the federal government, and that if they did not take steps not to implement the law, they would have no other choice but to be able to file a lawsuit. And so the U.S. Department of Justice filed a lawsuit against the state of Oklahoma for passing this bill that, in my opinion, is blatantly unconstitutional. In addition to the U.S. Department of Justice filing suit against the state of Oklahoma, there were also some community organizations and individuals within the state of Oklahoma, with the help of the ACLU and the National Immigration Law Center, who were also able to file a lawsuit. And so currently there are 2 lawsuits pending against the state of Oklahoma. The cases have been filed in federal court, and currently we're awaiting the state government, the Attorney General's response. And so the governor, or the federal judge, had set a scheduling order that the Attorney General's response is due on June 13th. So here in just a few days. And so in addition to the Attorney General's response, then the U.S. Attorney General's office and the ACLU will have a chance to be able to file a rebuttal. And so I believe that that's due by June 18th. And so then the judge will make a decision. In addition to that, one of the promising things that is shown in the scheduling order is that the judge specifically did not ask for any information having to do with whether or not to grant an injunction. And so that the fact that the judge specifically said that wasn't necessary gives a lot of community advocates hope that that's already been decided by the judge, and that he's inclined to grant that injunction before the law is set to go into effect, which is on July 1st.
Right. And is there any indication of when the legal proceedings might wrap up?
No, not necessarily.
Okay, gotcha.
Typically, federal cases are fast-tracked, and so, but I mean, at this point, they've just filed the complaints a couple weeks ago, and so, like I said, we're fully anticipating that the very first hearing will be before then. However, like I said, the judge specifically said he did not need arguments when it came to granting an injunction. In other cases where similar laws have been passed in other states, including Texas, Iowa, and Florida, in all of those states, federal judges granted injunctions. And so it makes me hopeful that the judge here in Oklahoma is inclined to do the same.
Okay, wonderful. And it is worth mentioning that this was foreseeable. And in fact, you had mentioned this in debate on the Senate. You brought it up to Senator Treat, who's the Senate co-author of the bill, that this was just on its face in contradiction to the ruling on Arizona versus the United States in 2012, which, as you mentioned, is what is specified that in addition to what's written in the Constitution, that immigration is the purview of the federal government, that it ruled that is the case, and that it isn't a second crime to be here after having illegally entered in the first place, right? So this was something that was foreseeable and is logically the consequence of that.
Well, and so if we respect the rule of law, then that U.S. versus Arizona would be the case that controls in this situation. That, like I said, has explicitly made it the exclusive province of the federal government when it comes to immigration issues. And so, no, I was able to point that out to Pro Tem Treat. And so, but I mean, it's one of those things that Pro Tem Treat said, the composition of the Supreme Court has changed since then. And so again, one of these strategies to try and push the current supposedly conservative court to be activist in disrespecting prior case law.
Sure, yes. And so anything else you want to say as far as specifically on House Bill 4156 before broadening out?
No, just that people should be vigilant. And so if there are people who are watching or listening who are members of families who have people who are undocumented, that at this point I don't think that there's a reason to panic. And there are lots of people that were asking whether or not they should leave the state of Oklahoma, because we have very strong confidence that the judge is likely to issue an injunction, and even stronger confidence that when the court eventually rules that they're going to rule that this law is unconstitutional, that it's important that people pay attention, but there's no reason right now for people to be able to panic. And so whenever school starts back in the fall, there shouldn't be any hesitation at all to feel confident to be able to enroll and send your kids to school. At this point, the other thing is that we have allies. And so not only do we have allies in the U.S. Department of Justice, not only do we have allies with the ACLU and the National Immigration Law Center, but we have allies with employers and allies with people who own businesses, large businesses and smaller businesses, but people that realize that without immigrant labor, a lot of the thriving economy in the state of Oklahoma would grind to a halt. And so one of the unexpected consequences of having our rally on May 15th is that a large restaurant chain here in the state of Oklahoma, out of respect to their employees, decided to be able to shut down that day. And so I would mention their name just to encourage people to be able to patronize those restaurants and those businesses that are supportive of their immigrant employees. And so it's Hal Smith restaurants. And so as a result, every time that I've gone out to eat, probably within the past 3 weeks, I've gone to a Hal Smith restaurant because, again, they came out publicly and explained that in support of their employees and at probably some great expense, they decided to shut down 30 restaurants on that day. And so, like I said, there are allies out there, and it's just a matter of being able to work together to be able to see this through.
Right. And so immigration is a hot button issue at the national level, at the state level.
Right.
So maybe we can just kind of begin from the very, very basics, and more drawn in your work as an immigration attorney.
Sure.
What is the process like? Let's say if you're just starting from scratch as somebody, as a foreign national, let's say you're a citizen of Mexico and you want to move to America. What is, the phrase, the right way? What is it? Describe that process. What is that?
Well, I mean, so I mean, there are all sorts of different right ways in my opinion, and so there's a legal path to it. Then that's a right way, and so currently there are family-based applications, and so part of the problem with family-based applications is that you can only apply for immediate family, and so there's some limitations and restrictions on that. And for many of those categories, there's a limited number of visas available every year. And the problem is that they receive thousands and thousands more applications than they have visas available. And so as a result, there are backlogs. And so, for example, for a U.S. citizen applying for his Mexican brother, currently they're giving green cards to people who filed their very first application, I want to say in the year 2001. And so there's a waiting list, and currently that waiting list is 23 years long. And so the prospects of someone filing that application through their brother and having to wait, it's not that they would be able to set a clock that in 23 years they'd be able to fix their papers, but what would happen is that they're just in a waiting list where there's 23 years worth of people ahead of them in line, that each person ahead of them gets their chance before they get theirs. And so as a result, family-based immigration, also employment-based immigration, for the most part, there are limitations on the numbers of visas, and in the categories are backlogged, and so that's part of the problem. And then there's just poor immigration policy that doesn't encourage people to get in line with existing law. And so one of the parts of the law that's never made sense to me is, since 1996, if someone's here in the United States and they accrue more than 1 year illegally here in the United States, if they leave the country for whatever reason, because maybe a family gets sick in their country, or maybe they miss their family, they want to visit, or maybe there's some other type of emergency. If someone's been here unlawfully for more than a year and they leave the country for whatever reason, whenever they leave, they're penalized 10 years when they leave the United States to go back to their country. And so to me, it basically that encourages and almost forces people to stay here so that they don't trigger that 10-year bar. And so it doesn't make sense to me if the stated policy strategy is to convince people who are undocumented to leave, why you would create a disincentive to leave by creating a penalty of 10 years if you leave the United States. And so unfortunately that hamstrings a lot of people in being able to apply for their permanent residence. In addition, if you leave and you trigger that 10-year bar and then you come back again unlawfully, then you have a permanent bar that you can never fix your papers for the rest of your life. And that's regardless if you have a spouse who's an American citizen, it's regardless if you have kids that are born here in the United States, it's regardless if any of those kids are disabled. Basically, if you leave the United States and then you come back, you trigger a permanent bar that prevents you from ever being able to get your green card. And so regardless of your family situation, regardless of what you do or how you contribute here in the United States. And so as a result, it's quite obvious to me, after having done this for a long time, that the immigration system, the way that it is, it's broken. And so we resort to other types of applications, whether that be under the Violence Against Women's Act, or whether it be a T visa, which is for victims of human trafficking, or a U visa, which helps people who are victims of violent crime. But obviously those are small groups, and it greatly limits the amount of people that you can try and help.
And so you mentioned the process for somebody who already has family members here. What if you don't have any family here? What if you don't have any sponsors here in the States? I mean, what is that process?
Well, and so without a family-based application or an employment-based application, basically you're almost completely shut out of the process of being able to get your permanent residence. For some people, if they've recently arrived in the United States and they're fleeing some sort of political persecution, there's always the chance for political asylum, but those laws have made it almost impossible for someone to win an asylum case. And if someone comes to the United States and they unknowingly, if they allow more than a year to pass before they file the application, they're barred from being able to file that asylum application. So as a result, in most of those cases, I would say probably not knowing the exact numbers, but my educated guess would be anywhere between 90, probably close to 90% of all asylum cases fail because the standard of proof is so high. And so as a result, I think that anybody who's watched the news would probably be willing to acknowledge that there's been a crisis at the border. Obviously, ever since after COVID, the number of people who've come to the border the numbers have been bigger than they've ever been. Although within the past, I would say 6 to 8 months, the enforcement has changed in such a way that those numbers have gone down dramatically. But I think everybody's willing to acknowledge that there's been a crisis at the border and there have been a lot of new arrivals.
Mm-hmm. And I do want to talk a bit about what some potential solutions might be. Sure. But I think it is worth pointing out, as you mentioned earlier, this session for you was the most difficult, and perhaps it was the most polarized in our legislature, which is obviously a supermajority Republican. You're in the super minority here. But unfortunately, you and other members of the Latino caucus tend to have a very good relationship across the aisle. Built that relationship little by little, and as you mentioned, that allowed y'all to do some of the behind the scenes work to get some of the more reactionary immigration bills. For example, House Bill 3133 by J.J. Humphrey that would label any Hispanic involved with any drug crime as a terrorist. That was something y'all were able to effectively prevent from getting a floor hearing. And so that stuff is the important stuff. It's the unglamorous behind the scenes work that helps, that gets things done and prevents really bad things from getting done. Unfortunately, at the national level, immigration is obviously one of the most divisive, hot-button issues.
Sure.
And so I guess I would ask you, what are some lessons you've learned from the work you've done in reaching across the aisle that you would wish to see more at the federal level?
Well, I mean, I think that being collegial and being able to reach across the aisle, if you want results, right? If you want to feel like you're getting something done, I think is worthwhile. And so at the same time, you shouldn't have to sacrifice what you believe in, but trying to be able to find those like-minded people who are willing to be able to put policy ahead of politics, right? And to be able to work with anyone who's willing to come up with good policy. I mean, that's what we're all about. And so regardless of party affiliation, although 4156 was a vote along straight party lines. And again, I think that points to the fact that it was a political bill, right? It was based on polling. It was based on the fact that we have presidential elections and House and Senate elections coming up in November, and that this is the number one polling issue for Republican primary voters, right? And so any chance you can get, if you're in that situation, you're an incumbent, to be able to look tough on immigration probably helps you to get elected. But at what cost? Right? And so as a result, again, being able to be strategic, to be able to work with others, to be able to take those bills out or to stop them from being able to get a hearing is definitely, it can be very, very effective. And so it may not be very glamorous or it may not catch the headlines, but it's good work that helps our community for sure.
Right. And unfortunately, at the top levels, at the presidential level, very recently Joe Biden passed an executive order on immigration. But before then, there was a big struggle with the Senate bill authored by our own U.S. Senator Lankford on immigration. But unfortunately, as I mentioned, at the top of the tickets, whether it be Trump or Biden, particularly in Trump's case, he tends to be very reactionary, tends to rile up ways of getting support for his own cause at the expense of even legislation on immigration, for example. Right. So this, it seems to me, is one of the big problems, that being an election year, it's not only at the top of the level, it's become a local level, like we see with 4156.
Right.
And it worries me that people, it seems to have more energy to argue and fight about these things and try to come up with any solutions to these sorts of things. So by way of thinking in terms of solutions, are there any promising signs at the federal level you've seen that you think would be potentially helpful to the immigration crisis?
There's always things that are being floated, right? And so I think that one of the things that I just read about, I guess yesterday or day before in the New York Times, is that President Biden is thinking of expanding parole in place, which is an opportunity that's currently afforded to spouses spouses of U.S. citizens serving in the armed forces the opportunity to apply for basically what would count as a legal entry to help them to be able to adjust status in the United States instead of having to go back to their country. And so I think that based on what I was able to read, they would change it to where it wouldn't just be limited to military families, but it would be open to anyone. And so if there were a person who is married to a U.S. citizen, that they could apply for this parole in place, which would basically be a permit that counts as a legal entry that would allow people to fix their papers here in the United States instead of having to leave. Again, the problem is when you leave, you trigger that 10-year bar that I explained before. And but it would only help a small group of people. It wouldn't help those people perhaps who have already left and come back and trigger that permanent bar. And so it would help a little bit. And so I know that for President Biden, or just for politicians in general, I mean, it's a tightrope trying to be able to walk, to be able to address the I think sometimes the legitimate concerns of voters without selling out to one side or the other when it comes to policy.
Sure. And on this podcast and other contexts, I've complained before that whereas Democrats in their rhetoric tend to be very welcoming and nice towards immigrants, in their policy they're often very lacking. Either there's no substantive policies put forward to actually solve the problem, or when push comes to shove, they go to very restrictive border policy, like with his executive orders. I don't know how closely you followed this most recent executive order on immigration, but if you could detail what you know of it.
Well, and so no, I think that it's President Biden's acknowledgement that the border has been in crisis probably, I think, before he ever came into office. And so as a result, with the multitudes of people that were coming at the border, and after the national emergency pursuant to COVID no longer existed, whether or not he had the statutory authority to be able to shut down the borders, or to shut down the border, or to be able to limit people entering the United States. And so me personally, being an immigration attorney, I've had lots of people that were allowed to enter the United States where I was left scratching my head how this happened. And I think it was just because the resources at the border were overwhelmed by the numbers. And so again, trying to be able to get things under control. And so I think that President Biden probably didn't have many alternatives. And again, based on people being able to watch with their own eyes what's going on at the border, from legitimate news sources, much less the political news sources, that there really has been a crisis. And so trying to be able to get that under control is something that I think he had no choice, but he had to be able to do. But that being said, ACLU has already said they're going to file a lawsuit against it because they don't believe that he has the legal authority to do it without that national emergency, the way that President Trump did under COVID. And so I guess it'll be litigated. But for right now, being an election year, I don't know if there's many people out there talking about serious policy about solving the immigration issues that we have here in the United States. 100%,
and it's made much worse when one of the two major candidates is obviously having many legal troubles and different scandals all the time. And being that you're a lawyer here, maybe you could go into some details about just how unique Donald Trump's situation is in terms of prior candidates, but also like his current situation as it stands is very complicated. Most of the cases have been delayed, so where now it seems that they would come only after the election. What is the circumstance?
Well, obviously he's been convicted, and so I guess here in somewhere close to 30 days he's set for sentencing on these charges. I think there are legal questions as far as having a president who's a convicted felon. Some of those types of issues that are completely new ground. I think we're going to have to wait and see. To me, being someone who I like to think that I approach national news with a critical eye, and applying common sense. It makes it difficult for me to understand how people can support our previous president, because so little of what he talks about is serious, or if it is serious, then it's scary, because he talks about trying to change our democracy toward a more authoritarian form of government.
Sure. Right?
And so from time to time he says things like that, no, but I was only joking. Well, this isn't the time for jokes. This is a time to be serious. This is, being the president of the United States is a serious thing. And so, like I said, I understand that there's a lot of unrest in the state, and a lot of frustration within the United States. But supporting a candidate that at a minimum is committed to governing within the rules and the restrictions of our government,
sure,
based on the powers that citizens have been willing to give government. To me, that doesn't seem like a difficult situation when you look at the two candidates.
Sure.
Right? There's one who's committed to to governing under the rules the way they are, and so whether you look at it and you look at the prior president's convictions, and the fact that rather than dispute that he did what they said that he did, that he talks about a witch hunt, he talks about crooked judges, he talks about all these things that really disrespect our democracy, right? That are dismissive and disrespectful of our entire government. And at the same time, on the other side, I think you have someone that definitely, at a minimum, is committed to governing, right? To being able, not toward using his office for his own personal reasons, and not to use it as political retribution against his opponents. But ideally, if we can kind of come out of this spiral that I think we found ourselves in since the previous president got elected, and to get back to believing in our process and our system, the way that it was set up by our founding fathers, and the way that it's developed ever since.
I think it is worth mentioning, though, that there is something of I think kind of a tragedy to his legal troubles. That the first case that we've been talking about so far, his conviction in Manhattan over falsifying business records and the Stormy Daniels affair and so forth,
sure,
with the 34 felony counts. That is the first one that came up. But I think in some ways that of the things he's accused of in courts is one of the more trivial matters, especially compared to January 6th or his classified documents and so forth. And so unfortunately, as a news story, I think the reception of the set of legal troubles that he has, by the time we get to the more serious ones, it'll almost seem played out in terms of national attention, where it's, oh, this is just another one of his legal cases. Where unfortunately, it seems to me that on a moral level, perhaps the most troublesome thing that he did was to fail to accept the election results and continue to see his many attempts to steal the election, meanwhile claiming exactly the opposite, that it was being stolen from him. But unfortunately, I think by the time we get to those trials, it'll, like I said, in terms of the national attention, it'll seem played out like, oh, this is just another one of many. And I don't know what your feelings are on that. If you think that matters at all, but I think that. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're good. Well, I was just gonna say, because the legal ramifications of these will be brand new territory for our country, right? We've never had a president convicted before, but in terms of how it will actually impact people's perceptions on him as a candidate, I worry that there'll be kind of a dulling effect, where there's so many of these going on all at once that it's hard for the average person to pay attention to any one of them, given the cumulative effect of all of them, what seems all at once, and the fact that the first one, involved the porn star, seems rather trivial. It's a technical matter of how he fudged the numbers. It doesn't seem as striking and salient in moral terms as having attempted to steal an election, for example, calling up the Georgia Secretary of State asking for 11,780 votes, which is just like on his face how you would try to steal an election. And so it seems to me that unfortunately, the ones with the most moral weight are going to be buried in terms of how they are perceived as news stories.
Well, I mean, but basically, this was paying off someone not to come forward so that he could get elected to become president. And so, to me, if you're running a campaign and you're paying hush money or kickbacks to people, or making promises, political promises, in situations like that, I think that is as morally reprehensible as some of the other things. And so, yes, as far as asking for the votes in Georgia or doing some of these other things, I think really that the previous president has really lowered the standard, lowered the bar, and I think it's fair to say that he's numbed us to poor behavior that before his presidency would have never been accepted, and for better for worse, because I think he's a good con man, that he's got people pulled in and believing him when really I don't think I think if people were able to take a step back and look at the situation with a critical eye and apply common sense, you would know better, right? Mm-hmm. And so as far as the order in which the convictions come, I mean, I don't think the fact that this one came first makes it any less important, or the other ones that followed that makes them more important. I think that at this point, it feels to me that our democracy is weakened as a result of this, and when there's criticisms of judges that they're applying their political opinions in making decisions, and when you basically disregard the rule of law. You talk about doing things on your first day that would have never been accepted in the United States, and to start off saying that they're a joke, but as you get closer, it becomes more and more serious. That yes, I think that people need to be able to take a step back and look at this objectively, and perhaps consider their news sources, right? And to be able to see if what they're consuming, regardless of what extreme of the political spectrum you get your news, whether it's poison, right? Because I believe that there's poison on either end of the spectrum, and I think the very best way to govern going forward is through the middle, through compromise, through moderation, right? Because typically that's the way you make the best policy.
Okay, yeah. No, I do want to move on beyond these kind of more ordinary political concerns to some topics that are pressing on my mind, particularly with relation to artificial intelligence. I don't know how much you've thought about it, but one thing that to me is a very interesting possibility is the use of artificial intelligence in expediting the legal process. Right, we already have currently large language models that are able to pass the bar exam. And so one specific thing I would ask you at the state level is, have you considered sponsoring some kind of interim study for the use of artificial intelligence? I in particular would be very interested if it could be used in the immigration system to hopefully expedite the process. You mentioned earlier it's decades, it can be a decades-long process.
Right.
But if you were to have some kind of artificially intelligent system that could expedite the process, write legal briefs or something like that, so that immigration judges would be able to more quickly process claims, that could potentially be something that would help with the gridlock in terms of the legal system.
Well, I think you have to be careful, and so I think that from the limited knowledge that I have about artificial intelligence is that as it develops, somehow it develops a need or a desire to please whoever's asking, right? And so sometimes that artificial intelligence, from what I've seen, will make up cases or apply cases that don't apply in a situation. And so I know that every day that AI is getting better at being able to do some of these things, but really it's a tool. And so as far as being able to defer to it, or to go ahead and have it, make those arguments and to blindly sign them and submit them to a court, I mean, I don't think that we're there yet, right? Ultimately, I think it can be a useful tool, but again, it's still a tool that for the time being anyway, that needs to be kind of supervised and considered by human beings.
Sure. I would agree with that. But I guess the thing I would suggest is, because I do think one concern I have is the rate of change, the rate of progress with artificial intelligence will just radically outpace the rate of the ability of the government to respond to, whether it be at the state level or the federal level. So what I would hope is that at the state level, for example, the government takes a more proactive approach. Now, Representative Arturo Alonso and Daniel Pay have been on the ball. There's been some of the people that have helped start this study, at least on the House level. But are there any talks among senators to do any sort of similar AI interim study of any sort?
I haven't heard of any, and so at this point they haven't published the request, or the haven't announced which requests for interim studies that have been approved. And so that I know that, or I believe that Representative Alonso was able to work with Senator Dave Rader on a couple pieces of legislation having to do with AI this last session. And so again, Rep. Alonso definitely is my authority whenever it comes to all things having to do with AI. And so I would say that, having a chance to go with him to different conferences of legislators, that Rep. Alonso has really established himself as an authority, a national authority, whenever it comes to AI. And so I know that he's been able to convene several different meetings and also been a presenter on different panels to legislators nationwide. Mm-hmm. And so as a result, having that type of person be a colleague and also a member of the Latino caucus is something I feel very fortunate about.
Yep, wonderful.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would just one last plug. I would suggest the idea of considering an interim study on the Senate side, particularly in terms of expediting legal process. Not to give AI the final say or whatever, right? But to have it be potentially one tool among many to help expedite the process. But beyond the use of it at the policy level, I think there will be in the very near future very real concerns about the concept of digital citizenship, both in terms of we, human beings, as people that use the internet, what our rights are, what our rights to our privacy, to our data are.
Sure.
And so are there any talks about those kinds of concerns at the state level in the Senate?
I mean, I know that there are concerns as far as whenever it comes to privacy online. I think one of the overarching issues right now are kids, right? And whether or not if they consume too much of this too soon, how it affects them developmentally, right? And so whether that means, developing empathy, developing critical thinking skills, being able to do some of these things, that I think there's real concern that too much access to online material as well as social media isn't good for kids. And so I think, like I said, at several of the conferences that I go to, that seems to be one of the things that's most important, is trying to be able to figure out how you don't limit free speech, but at the same time, you do not allow kids' development to be negatively impacted by social media and by online content.
Sure. And I do share a lot of those concerns, that particularly for kids, there does seem to be a lot of detrimental health on their mental health in particular. But one thing I'm also sort of optimistic about in terms of the near future is how AI itself and different digital resources can be used to augment the educational process, right? And this is something I know Arturo's big on as well, is how it is that we can in the near future begin to use artificial intelligence in the classroom. An analogy I like is that to comparing it to the calculator, right? Whereas the calculator in math classes and advanced science classes, right, is one of the core competencies developed in these classes, right? Mm-hmm. And so maybe in the near future for writing essays, for doing research, AI itself will be similar to the calculator, right? Not an end in itself, not something that you use for the final product, but something along the way to help in your problem-solving skills. And maybe this could be even something that legislators could potentially use, right? 'Cause very few legislators are lawyers, right? And so there's kind of a tragedy there that the people that write the laws, very few of them actually studied the laws. But maybe AI could be some way to help give summaries of relevant case law, to present ways by which there are connections to different laws on the books at the state level, at the national level, to communicate at a level that's easier for non-lawyers to understand prior case law and whatever resources there might be. I don't know if that's something you've considered at all.
Maybe not in that context, but I think it's definitely a tool that can help to be able to provide some information and also some analysis. But again, to be able to apply critical thinking skills to what's being said, and also to be able to apply empathy, right? Because if it's artificial intelligence, I know that there are people out there working to be able to build empathy into those algorithms or whatever it is that goes into artificial intelligence, but ultimately they're not humans, and that we ideally, hopefully, as time goes on, not only does AI lack perhaps humanity, but it feels a little bit over the past several years that humans have lost a lot of their humanity, right? And when it seems like that empathy has decreased, and kind of optimism, kind of willingness to be able to be idealistic and to be able to be concerned about someone other than yourself. And so and I don't know that comes from too much. I mean, if too much social media, too many kind of, like I said before, kind of media outlets that serve up poison from either political extreme. That right now people I don't think people are necessarily at their best, right? And I don't know if that's because they've been fed a diet of misinformation to the point where initially it scared them and now it's made them angry. But I don't think a lot of people are thinking very rationally right now, and I don't think that they're thinking in a way that makes the country a better place.
Sure. And that is a concern as well. But I do want to get into some more, they may seem abstract considerations about artificial intelligence, but I think in the very near future, this will be people like you's problem, the people that write the laws, the policies problem, that, for example, like you said, right, AI is not human.
Yes.
Right? It seems to lack empathy, but that doesn't mean it will lack power to do things, right? And so if we reach a point at which an artificially intelligent machine is able to, for example, commit crimes, right? If it's able to complete an action that it was not programmed to have done, if its programmer had explicit intention X, but the machine does Y, and Y is illegal, right? Who would be held accountable, right? This raises interesting questions about, like, will a machine be able to be granted habeas corpus in a court, right? If it has the power, for example, to generate wealth, if you had a machine that was able to independently do stock trading, have business endeavors and so forth, would it have to pay taxes, right? So this is another version of the idea of digital citizenship I'm interested in. Not digital citizenship of humans, but potentially citizenship of machines,
right?
And how that would be, right? And this is something I suspect nobody in the legislature is talking about at this point, probably, right?
I haven't.
Okay, yeah. And see, and that's something that concerns me. I think a lot of your colleagues would probably think, well, that's a very far off problem. That's not going to be in my lifetime, but I worry it will be. And by the time the government grasps the problem in the first place, it will be at the point at which it's already been a problem in practice. It's already on the ground level been an issue, whether it be that a machine causes the death of people, for example, you say self-driving cars and so forth, that if it has a terrible accident, or if it goes on a horrible rampage and runs people over, right? Who is to be accountable for that? If it acted in a way that it wasn't programmed to have, it seems something was responsible if it causes deaths. But it's not clear to me who, right? If we're talking about the programmers, if it didn't program it to do that, if you can prove that it didn't prove it, if you can prove that it didn't program to have done the crime, this is going to be a real dilemma, I think, ethically, but also in terms of the law.
Okay.
And so that's something I would hope to, from this conversation, to get you thinking about, is the different ways in which the agency of machines will become a matter of law, and I hope of policy preemptively, but I think there also is kind of an equal and opposite peril of too much regulation from people that don't understand the potential of artificial intelligence on the one hand, and the absence of any thought about these issues from people that don't consider the pitfalls of artificial intelligence on the other hand. And so, I mean, that I say as kind of a spur to hopefully get you to think more about this and potentially look into interim studies. I do think this will be, for my generation in particular, one of the key issues defining our relationship both to technology, but potentially to law as well, right? I mean, in terms of its different applications to different things, a whole bunch of different things, right? For example, things like providing legal advice potentially one day, or if it's doing medical screenings, if we have different ways by which ordinary services that are done by humans can be done more cheaply by machines, right? That again will
Sure.
be, and again, this will come into contact with practical questions, right? If your physician is a machine, well, how would insurance cover that, right? Could it write off, prescriptions? Could it do these things, right? These are all may seem kind of far out questions, but I think in the very near future,
Sure.
they'll be very practical questions.
Well, that machines can do that, but whether or not we allow the machines to do that, right?
Sure.
And ultimately there would be someone who'd made that decision, and so ultimately who would be responsible, whether it's a self-driving car or some of the other technologies that you've talked about, are the people that relinquish control to that machine or design that machine in a way that's somehow flawed, right?
Sure. But and that's kind of looking at the potential downsides, but looking at the upsides too. I mean,
Right.
it also raises interesting ethical questions. If we reach a point where a machine can perform like a medical examination as efficiently as a human doctor, but let's say theoretically it could do so much more cheaply,
Yes.
right? It almost seems at that point that we have an ethical obligation to sponsor these sorts of things, to have more of that sort of
Right.
thing. And so again, that will be another issue where I don't know if legislators are even thinking in these terms, but I think they really should, right? I think the potential in the short term, but certainly in the long term, is for a
Right.
dramatic increase in quality of life if we are proactive about using it for the interests of the citizens, right?
Right.
Whether it be, as I mentioned, in law, in healthcare, but a whole series of other things that we can't even imagine at this point, right?
Mhm.
And taking the technology we have already, this also raises other concerns that I think may at first seem very abstract, kind of weird questions. Like one question that I do wonder about
Mhm.
is the possibility of whether or not the internet could become conscious. Now, this sounds like a bizarre thing to say, but I can explain by analogy to the brain, right? Whereas if you take in the brain the neurons and the synapses that are going on, if we had a circumstance in which computers and satellites and the connections between the two were to form a mind of some sort, right? If you had the interaction, the information processing capabilities were to become advanced enough and centralized enough, if there was something that is like to be the internet, right?
Okay.
This is sort of a bizarre thing. You might raise the question, well, even if that analogy were somehow to go along, where is this consciousness happening, right?
Right.
And I don't have the answer to that. But similarly, if I took you and I shrunk you down to the size smaller than a neuron and stuck you in a human brain, and you looked around in the human brain, and you see the neurons, you see the synapses, but you say, well, where's this consciousness happening? Again, it's not clear to me how we could even recognize that, but if we were to develop, in the case of the internet or in different artificially intelligent machines, subjects, things that have qualitative experience, right? That becomes an ethical issue, right? If it's able to suffer, if it's able to have well-being, if it's able to develop intentions, if it's able to become a volitional agent, to use the legal term, right? That I think will, I mean, at first it kind of seems like an abstract question, but if at some point, if we're imprisoning machines somehow, if we're enslaving machines,
Why don't we just unplug them?
Well, maybe that'll be one. But
Right?
but in all seriousness, that raises a question: if
Yeah.
we do have a machine like that, would that be a form of murder? Because if it were a conscious system, or not even a conscious system, but a system that has the capability to, abstractly represent the world, to form beliefs, to have an opinion on things, to have more and more features that seem like a mind, right? That actually does become an interesting question. And you can imagine, to make it more practical, let's say that idea of unplugging, right? Well, what if you're an AI developer and I'm your rival AI developer and I go and unplug your stuff? Well, that also seems like a crime too, but it doesn't just seem like a property crime.
But it's not alive, right? Whatever they unplugged.
I don't think so yet, for sure, not yet.
Right.
But I think increasingly the boundary will become blurry. And at the point at which we can't really say for certain, I mean, even in the human cases, right? For example, like comatose patients, right? It's not, if a person has no independently functioning organs or brain activity, in some ways, I mean, it seems like they have a different status as a living being than you or I, right? But we still would never want to say that that's not a person, that their life should not be considered, right? And so my worry is kind of in the reverse order. We're beginning with machines that seem like comatose patients now, But if we, take that doubt of, well, what if it is potentially conscious just in a way that we can't know? What if it potentially is a sort of mind in there that we can't yet understand, and maybe never will, right, because we're not machines? That does, to me, seem to have ethical weight as well.
Maybe. I don't know. And so I think that my theory at this point is that there's some sort of biological component to life. And so if you are digital or if you're not biologically based, then a human has made you, and you can get as close as you possibly can to perhaps having a mind or being sentient or whatever it is. But whether or not you ever get there, I don't know. And so at this point, part of the components for life is that it's biologically based, right? It's not just intelligence. It's not just those other things. Then that person who's comatose is alive because they're biologically based.
Sure. So, but again, I think the boundaries there too will become blurry as well with things like Neuralink, where you have microchips implanted into people's brains.
Right.
If you kind of project that out into the future far enough, I mean, you could potentially have a situation where we're something like cyborgs, where your human biological system at first, but you can come in increasingly machine parts. Let's say you reach the point at which you're 51% machine, 49% human. You're more machine than human.
Right.
At that point, I don't think either of us would deny that is a living being. What sort of living being that is? I mean, it was at first a human. If it's now mostly machine, or if it crosses over into a threshold where, let's say, you were somehow able to remove a human brain and put it into a machine, and so some kind of process by that where its conscious experience, yes, is a biological brain, but its bodily form is not biological. Right. This gets into a weird area where it's not quite clear to me that distinction. You get me? So,
it is a weird area.
Yes.
But if the biological brain is still biological, then it will atrophy as time goes on, right?
Presumably. Yeah.
Right? And so there's still something biological there.
Sure.
Right. And at some point, if we are able to upload everything that is in our mind into a computer, then if I am still around, then I guess that's, God willing, hopefully it doesn't happen in the next 6 years, because I'm term limited. And so after 6 years, it's on somebody else. Right?
Yep. Do you have any plans for after 6 years and 7 years where you'll be?
Yeah, I want to be an immigration lawyer full time.
Nice.
And so I used to do that. And so it'd be nice. I mean, at this point, I'm an immigration lawyer 8 months out of the year. The office is still here. We still have other attorneys who are doing the work and assistants doing applications, representing clients in court, and going to interviews. And then also being a criminal defense attorney. And so I love it. And so far, technology and the things that you talk about have been complementary to my practice. At some point, whether or not it threatens what we do, I have to see, right? And so I think that's probably something that's true of a lot of professions, right? A lot of jobs. Is as time goes on, I think technology will accelerate to be able to require fewer of those people doing those types of jobs. But given the fact of when I was born and perhaps how long I will be here, we'll see. But as far as first of all, I still have to get elected one more time. So I'm up for re-election in 2 years. So in 2 years, you'll see the signs and see all the calls for volunteers, the same things that Sam Morgan is doing right now with an election 1 week from today. I will be, if I decide to do so, I'll be back doing that in 2 years from now. But after that, 4 years of that, and then I think I'm done.
Really?
And yes. And
so
then,
no plans for a higher office at all?
And kind of you mentioned the fact that I'm the member of a super minority. And so I think to be able to run for office, I have to believe that I'm going to win. And so unless there's some huge sea changes in the state of Oklahoma, but I really don't think so. I think I enjoy being part of a collegial body and part of a group. The idea of running for an office statewide or one of those things where maybe I would be an on the executive side of government does not appeal at all to me, because I think there's even more pressure to compromise your values for political expediency. And I feel that one of the empowering things about being in the super minority in the legislature is that you don't have those things come up nearly as often. And so as a result, having to compromise what you believe in doesn't come up nearly as often when you're part of the super minority, when you're empowered to be able to speak your mind and to call out those things that aren't right.
Cool. Is there anything else you'd like to mention by way of closing this up?
No, I don't think so. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
And no, this has been a fascinating experience and thought-provoking, especially when it comes to the future and what's going to happen with AI and some of these other things. So no, I appreciate very much the opportunity.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, sir. I appreciate your time.
All right, man. Thank you.